A revolution never begins with a gunshot. It begins with an idea, a fracture in allegiance. How did loyal English subjects, an ocean away, proud inheritors of the Magna Carta and the glorious Revolution, become the sworn enemies of the very king they once revered? The answer lies not in a single act of tyranny, but in a long, slow unwinding of trust, a clash of empires, and the stubborn conviction of a people who believed they were born free. Before the fissure, there was the crucible. The story of American independence does not begin in 1776, but 2 decades earlier, in the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the Ohio River Valley. Here, 2 colossal European empires, Britain and France, collided in a struggle for a continent. This conflict, the French and Indian War, would become the American theater of a global conflagration known as the 7 Years' War. It would forge a generation of leaders, drain the coffers of an empire, and paradoxically, sow the very seeds of the rebellion that would follow. The Ohio Valley was the prize. It was a fertile land of opportunity, a gateway to the heart of the continent. To the British colonists, it represented expansion and wealth. To the French, it was a vital link connecting their Canadian territories with their Louisiana settlements. And for the Native American nations who had lived there for centuries, it was simply home. The French, with a network of forts and strong alliances with tribes like the Algonquin and the Huron, had a firm grip on the region. But British land speculators and fur traders, backed by the growing colonial populations, pushed relentlessly westward. The fragile peace was about to shatter. In 1754, the governor of Virginia dispatched a small militia force to assert British claims. Their mission was to construct a fort at the forks of the Ohio, the strategic point where 3 rivers meet. The man leading this expedition was a young, ambitious, and inexperienced Virginia planter, only 22 years old. His name was George Washington. Washington's small force was too late. The French had already built Fort Duquesne at the coveted spot. Undeterred, Washington pressed on. His men ambushed a small French patrol, an incident that lit the fuse of a global war. The French retaliated swiftly. Washington and his men were surrounded at a hastily built stockade they called Fort Necessity. Outnumbered and outgunned, Washington was forced to surrender. This humiliating defeat was the first major battle of the French and Indian War. It was a baptism by fire for the future commander of the Continental Army. More importantly, it sent a shockwave back to London. The skirmish in the American wilderness had escalated. The British government could no longer ignore the conflict simmering on its colonial frontier. An empire was about to commit its full military might to North America, a decision that would change the destiny of the world forever. The war was brutal and unforgiving. Early British efforts, led by generals unfamiliar with wilderness warfare, were disastrous. The most infamous example was the expedition of General Edward Braddock in 1755. Braddock, a veteran of European battlefields, marched his column of red-coated regulars into the dense forest, a perfect target for the guerrilla tactics of the French and their native allies. In a devastating ambush near Fort Duquesne, Braddock's force was annihilated. Braddock himself was mortally wounded, and the British Army was sent into a panicked retreat. Serving as an aide to Braddock was George Washington, who witnessed the carnage firsthand. He learned a valuable lesson that day. European tactics were not suited for the American wilderness. It was a lesson he would remember 2 decades later. For the colonists, these early defeats were terrifying. Their frontiers were exposed to raids, their homes and families vulnerable. They saw the mighty British Army, supposedly their protector, fail time and again. A sense of self-reliance began to grow. Colonial militias, like Rogers Rangers, became masters of irregular warfare, adapting to the harsh environment in ways the British regulars could not. They were fighting for their own homes, their own land, their own survival. The tide of the war finally turned with a change in leadership in London. William Pitt the Elder became Prime Minister, and he recognized that North America was the key to victory. He poured unprecedented resources into the war, treating the colonial governments as partners rather than subordinates, and promising to reimburse them for their expenses. This new strategy reinvigorated the war effort. British and colonial forces, now working together with greater purpose, began to capture key French forts, Louisbourg, Fort Frontenac, and finally, Fort Duquesne, which the British rebuilt and renamed Fort Pitt. The climax of the war came in 1759 on the Plains of Abraham, outside the walls of Quebec City. In a daring and risky maneuver, British General James Wolfe led his men up a steep cliff under the cover of darkness, surprising the French garrison. The battle that followed was short but decisive. Both Wolfe and the French commander Montcalm were killed, but the British victory was complete. With the fall of Quebec, the heart of New France, the war in North America was effectively over. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 officially ended the 7 Years' War. It was a resounding victory for the British Empire. France ceded all of its North American territories east of the Mississippi River to Britain. The British flag now flew over an empire that stretched from the frozen north to the Florida Peninsula. The colonists rejoiced. The French threat that had loomed over them for generations was finally gone. The path was clear for westward expansion. They had fought alongside British regulars, shed their blood for the crown, and emerged victorious. They felt a surge of pride in being British. But this shared victory concealed deep-seated problems. The war had cost a staggering amount of money, leaving Britain with a mountain of debt. The British government, looking at the vast new territory it had to govern and defend, believed it was only fair that the American colonists, who benefited most from the victory, should help pay for it. The stage was set for a new kind of conflict, one not of muskets and forts, but of taxes and principles. The war that secured an empire for Britain had also taught its American subjects how to fight, and it had left them with a growing sense of their own identity, distinct from that of the mother country. The seeds of revolution, sown in the wilderness of the Ohio Valley, were about to sprout. Thank you for watching. If you found this history compelling, please subscribe for more chapters in the story of how a nation was forged. At the heart of the 7 Years' War's opening chapter stood a young, ambitious Virginia surveyor, just 21 years old, eager to make his mark on the world, George Washington. In the bitter midwinter of 1753, he embarked on a perilous mission deep into the Ohio country. His task? To deliver a British ultimatum to the French, demanding they abandon their forts and territory claimed by Virginia. The French, of course, politely refused. This diplomatic failure set the stage for conflict. A year later, in 1754, it was a fateful skirmish involving Washington. Small force at a place we now call Jumonville Glen, it became the spark that ignited a global war. This was Washington's first taste of real command, and it was a harsh one. His first major engagement at the hastily constructed Fort Necessity ended in disaster. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered by the French and their native allies, Washington was forced into the only formal surrender of his entire military career. It was a profound humiliation for the aspiring officer. But through this failure, he learned invaluable lessons, brutal, unforgettable lessons about the realities of command, the complexities of frontier diplomacy, and the unforgiving nature of wilderness warfare. He was much like the American colonies themselves, coming of age in a world increasingly defined by conflict and imperial ambition. The war that followed, known in America as the French and Indian War, became a brutal education for the colonists. They fought and died alongside the disciplined British regulars, the famous Redcoats. In doing so, they developed a military confidence of their own, a sense of their own capabilities in this vast and dangerous continent. But alongside this growing confidence, a seed of resentment was planted. The colonists bristled at the undisguised arrogance of many British officers, who often treated the colonial militia with disdain and contempt, viewing them as undisciplined and inferior. It was a friction that would be remembered. Despite these tensions, when the war finally ended in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris, there was a shared, overwhelming sense of triumph. The great enemy, France, was vanquished from North America. Their vast colonial empire, stretching from Quebec down the Mississippi to Louisiana, was gone. The continent, it seemed, now lay wide open for British-American expansion, a boundless future secured by shared sacrifice and victory. The British Empire now stood at the absolute zenith of its power, an unmatched global superpower. From the frozen reaches of Canada to the sunny shores of Florida, the Union flag flew triumphant over a newly expanded American domain. And in the 13 colonies, from Boston to Savannah, American-born Englishmen celebrated this victory as their own. They were British and proud of it. They were proud of their heritage, their language, their rights as Englishmen, and their King, George III. For over a century, the relationship between London and its American colonies had been governed by a kind of tacit, unspoken understanding. Historians call it salutary neglect. Absorbed by endless conflicts and political intrigue back in Europe, the Crown had largely allowed the colonies a remarkable degree of self-governance. Their own local assemblies, elected by the colonists themselves, held the real power in day-to-day life. Crucially, they held the power of the purse. They had the authority to levy taxes and manage their own internal affairs. To the Americans, this wasn't some special privilege granted by a distant government. They saw it as their fundamental birthright as free Englishmen, a right enshrined in the Magna Carta and the Glorious Revolution. This system, though informal, had worked. It allowed the colonies to flourish, developing their own unique economies, societies, and political cultures, all while remaining loyal subjects of the Crown. But the war had changed everything. It had cost an astronomical amount of money, leaving Britain with a staggering, unprecedented national debt. And as officials in London looked across the Atlantic at their newly enlarged, incredibly valuable American empire, they began to think that this old, informal arrangement of salutary neglect was no longer sustainable. Someone had to pay for the defense and administration of this vast new territory. And to the minds of many in Parliament, it was only fair that the American colonists, who had benefited so much from the victory, should start paying their share. This new way of thinking would soon collide head-on with the colonists' cherished belief in their right to self-governance, setting the stage for an entirely new conflict, one that would pit brother against brother and change the course of history forever. The 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, as it was known in America, was a triumph for the British Empire. By 1763, the French fleur-de-lis had been lowered across North America. From the frozen reaches of Canada to the balmy shores of Florida, British dominion was supreme. For the American colonists who had fought alongside the Redcoats, it was a moment of immense pride. They were subjects of the most powerful empire on earth, their future seemingly boundless, their security guaranteed. The long, bloody struggle for the continent appeared to be over. A new era of peace and prosperity was dawning. But victory came at a staggering price. The war had plunged Great Britain into a chasm of debt, totaling £133 million, an astronomical sum. The cost of administering and protecting the vast new territories in America was projected to be immense. In London, a new logic took hold. The era of salutary neglect, that long period of benign indifference to colonial affairs, was over. King George III and his ministers believed it was time for the colonies to pay their fair share for the defense provided by the British Army. The first step was the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which forbade settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. To the colonists who had dreamed of westward expansion, it felt like a betrayal. The land they had fought for was now off limits, by order of a distant government. The true shockwave, however, arrived in 1765. In a direct departure from all precedent, Parliament passed the Stamp Act. This was not a tax on trade, collected at the ports, something the colonists had long accepted as a legitimate power of the empire to regulate commerce. This was something new, something deeply alarming. It was a direct, internal tax, imposed on the colonists without the consent of their elected assemblies. It was a tax on everyday life, requiring a government stamp on all sorts of paper goods, newspapers, pamphlets, legal documents, licenses, even playing cards and dice. It affected every level of society, from the dock worker buying a newspaper to the lawyer filing a brief, from the merchant clearing a ship's manifest to the couple applying for a marriage license. To the Americans, this was more than a financial burden. It was a constitutional crisis. It struck at the very heart of what it meant to be an Englishman. The American mind had been shaped by the radical ideas of the European Enlightenment. These were not just idle philosophies. They were the very bedrock of their political identity. From the English philosopher John Locke, they had inherited the belief in natural rights, levity, and property, and the powerful conviction that government was a social contract, existing only by the consent of the governed. If a government violated that contract, it could be legitimately resisted. From the French Baron de Montesquieu, they had learned the importance of separating powers to prevent the rise of tyranny, a fear that haunted the Anglo-American political tradition. And from thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, they absorbed ideas about popular sovereignty and the general will. These were not abstract theories. They were deeply held beliefs about the proper relationship between the state and the individual. And the central tenet of this belief system, a right cherished for centuries by Englishmen, was that no man's property could be taken from him in the form of taxes without his consent, expressed through his elected representatives. And therein lay the rub. The colonists had no representatives in the British Parliament. For a century and a half, they had taxed themselves through their own local assemblies, the Virginia House of Burgesses, the Massachusetts Assembly, the Pennsylvania Assembly. These were bodies they elected, bodies that were responsive to them. Now, a parliament 3,000 miles away, a body in which they had no voice, was claiming the right to tax their property directly. The British argued for the concept of virtual representation, that every member of parliament represented the interests of the entire empire, not just the district that elected him. To the colonists, this was a nonsensical fiction, a flimsy excuse for an unprecedented power grab. The cry of no taxation without representation was not a mere slogan. It was the articulation of a fundamental principle, a red line that they believed Parliament had just crossed. The stage was set, not just for protests and riots, but for a profound and revolutionary debate about the nature of rights, representation, and the very meaning of freedom itself. The seeds of revolution, sown in the debt of an empire, were beginning to germinate in the fertile soil of American ideas. Across the colonies, a wave of outrage found its voice in leaders who dared to challenge the crown. In Virginia, a fiery young lawyer named Patrick Henry stepped into the House of Burgesses. He didn't just debate, he ignited a fire. He put forth a series of resolutions, a bold declaration that only Virginians could tax Virginians. In a speech that crackled with defiance, he summoned the ghosts of history's fallen tyrants. He thundered a warning, a line that teetered on the edge of treason. Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, and George III ... double quotes, as cries of treason. Echoed through the chamber, he fearlessly finished, "May profit by their example." This was more than a legal argument. It was a challenge hurled across the Atlantic. While eloquent words filled the halls of government, a different kind of resistance was brewing in the streets and taverns. Groups began to form, calling themselves the Sons of Liberty. And in Boston, their undeniable leader was a brilliant propagandist, a man who understood the people's anger, Samuel Adams. Adams was the relentless engine of revolution in Massachusetts. While others debated abstract principles in comfortable parlors, he was a master of action, a true organizer. He knew that real power didn't just lie in reasoned debate, but in the raw energy of the street, the whispers in the tavern, and the bold headlines of the printing press. He was less a refined statesman and more a tireless, intense force of nature, a man of the people. Under the sharp guidance of Samuel Adams, the Sons of Liberty took those complex constitutional arguments and transformed them into powerful, unforgettable acts of popular defiance. Their methods were direct and often brutal. They didn't just write petitions. They confronted the stamp distributors face to face, using intimidation and sometimes property destruction to force them to resign their posts. In Boston, a furious mob, inflamed by the perceived injustice, went so far as to destroy the elegant home of Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson, a symbol of royal authority. These weren't isolated incidents. Similar acts of resistance erupted up and down the coast. The message was clear: the Stamp Act would not be enforced. This popular fury, this raw power from the ground up, was then strategically combined with a unified boycott of British goods, organized by colonial merchants. This economic warfare hit England precisely where it was most vulnerable: its wallet. Back in London, the economic fallout was undeniable. Panic began to set in among British merchants. Their warehouses were stuffed to the rafters with goods they couldn't sell to the American colonies. Their profits vanished, replaced by mounting debts. These powerful men began to lobby Parliament with increasing desperation, not out of sympathy for colonial rights, but out of sheer financial necessity. They clamored for repeal. Inside Parliament, voices of reason, like the great orator Edmund Burke, argued for pragmatism. They saw the escalating crisis and urged their colleagues to pull back from the brink. The pressure, both economic and political, became immense. Finally, in 1766, Parliament relented. They bowed to the economic reality and revoked the Stamp Act. News of the repeal sent waves of jubilation across the Atlantic. The colonies erupted in celebration. Bells rang, bonfires were lit, and toasts were made to the king. Most colonists believed they had won a total victory, that their fundamental rights as Englishmen had been challenged and successfully defended. It felt like the empire had been restored to its proper balance. But in their joyful celebrations, they overlooked a crucial, quiet detail. On the very same day they repealed the Stamp Act, Parliament passed another, far more ominous law, the Declaratory Act. It was a simple, stark, and absolute assertion of power. It stated, without ambiguity, that Parliament had the full right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The immediate crisis was over, but the fundamental conflict had not been resolved. It had only been deferred. The seeds of the next, larger confrontation had already been sown. The calm was short-lived. Just 1 year later, a man named Charles Townshend, a Chancellor of the Exchequer, thought he had a clever plan to outsmart the colonists. He introduced a new set of duties, this time on common goods like glass, lead, paint, paper, and most famously, tea. Townshend tried to argue that these were external taxes on imported goods, not internal taxes like the Stamp Act, and therefore they were perfectly acceptable. But the colonists weren't fooled by this wordplay. They saw it for what it was, another attempt to tax them without their consent. So the boycott started all over again, with Boston leading the charge. The colonists refused to buy British goods, hitting London's merchants where it hurt their wallets. But this time, London wasn't backing down. To enforce these new laws and crush the growing spirit of defiance in Boston, the British government made a truly fateful decision. It sent 2 regiments of regular troops, the Redcoats, to occupy the city. Imagine that a standing army arriving in your city during peacetime. For the colonists who cherished their liberties, this was a profound shock. It was the physical embodiment of tyranny, a constant, abrasive reminder that they were being ruled from across an ocean. The arrival of these soldiers in 1768 turned Boston into a powder keg. Friction was everywhere. and it was constant. Soldiers, who were poorly paid, competed with local laborers for part-time jobs, which bred resentment. Insults were hurled back and forth in the streets and taverns. Brawls became a common occurrence. The city felt like it was under occupation, and the tension just kept building and building, day after day. Everyone knew something had to give. And on the cold, snowy night of March 5th, 1770, it finally did. The powder keg exploded. It all started with a minor argument between a single British sentry and a local civilian. But in the tense atmosphere of Boston, even a small spark could ignite a blaze. A crowd quickly gathered, growing angrier and more aggressive by the minute. They began taunting the soldier, throwing snowballs, ice, and rocks. A small squad of redcoats, led by Captain Thomas Preston, arrived to try and restore order, but they soon found themselves surrounded by a hostile mob. The situation was spiraling out of control. It was chaotic, confusing, and terrifying for everyone involved. In the panic and the noise, someone gave an order, or perhaps no order was given at all, just a panicked reaction. A shot rang out, then another, and another. When the thick smoke from the muskets finally cleared, a horrific scene was revealed. 5 civilians lay dead or dying on the snow-covered street. It was a tragedy born from years of rising tension and mistrust. But in the hands of revolutionaries like Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty, it became something more. They immediately branded the event the Boston Massacre. A silversmith and patriot named Paul Revere created a powerful engraving of the incident. His version wasn't a factual depiction. It was a masterpiece of propaganda. It showed a line of British soldiers deliberately firing on an orderly, unarmed crowd like an organized execution. This inflammatory image was printed and circulated throughout the 13 colonies, and it worked exactly as intended. It horrified people and inflamed public opinion against the British, turning a street brawl into a symbol of British tyranny and a rallying cry for revolution. The road to war was becoming clearer with every drop of blood spilled on Boston streets. Thanks for watching. In a remarkable display of principle, Patriot leader John Adams defended the soldiers in court. He argued that a government of laws, not of men, must apply to everyone. Adams won their acquittal on the murder charges, a stunning legal victory. But the political damage was done. The sight of British soldiers shedding American blood had created martyrs and hardened attitudes on both sides, forging a narrative of tyranny that spread like wildfire through the colonies. Faced with this renewed and furious colonial outrage, London once again backed down. They repealed all the hated Townshend duties, hoping to calm the waters. All except one. A small, symbolic tax on tea, kept in place as a stubborn assertion of Parliament's right to tax the colonies. For 3 years, an uneasy truce prevailed, a fragile quiet before the next storm. Then, a crisis in a global corporation, half a world away, threatened to reignite the entire conflict. The British East India Company, a pillar of the empire and a behemoth of global trade, was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. Its warehouses were overflowing with unsold tea, and financial ruin seemed imminent. To bail out this corporate giant, Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773. The act was a clever, almost insidious ploy. It would allow the company to sell its massive surplus of tea directly to the American colonies. The price would be so low that, even with the remaining Townshend tax, it would be far cheaper than the smuggled Dutch tea most colonists drank. Parliament was betting that the colonists' love of a bargain would outweigh their political principles. But the Patriots saw it for what it was, a Trojan horse. This wasn't about cheap tea. It was a sophisticated attempt to trick them into paying the tax, and in doing so, implicitly accepting Parliament's right to impose any tax it wished. For colonial merchants who had built their businesses on trade, it also represented the terrifying threat of a government-backed monopoly that could wipe them out overnight. The response was swift and unified. In port cities across America, from Philadelphia to Charleston, Patriot committees organized and ensured the tea ships were turned away, sent back to England with their cargo untouched. But in Boston, the situation was different. The royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson, was determined to enforce the law and land the tea. He refused to allow the ships to leave the harbor until the tax was paid. A tense standoff began with 3 tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver sitting in Boston Harbor as a floating symbol of the dispute. The deadline for payment loomed. The standoff reached its explosive climax on the cold, tense night of December 16, 1773. Inside Boston's Old South Meeting House, the building was packed to the rafters with thousands of anxious citizens. Samuel Adams addressed the crowd, his fiery words whipping them into a frenzy. The atmosphere was electric, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Following a massive town meeting, the Sons of Liberty executed a well-planned operation. In a stunning act of defiance, they destroyed a fortune in private property, an amount equivalent to over $1 million today. The Boston Tea Party was not an act of rage. It was a calculated political statement. It was a direct challenge to British authority that London could not ignore. When news reached London, the reaction was apoplectic. All factions of the British political establishment were united in outrage. Patience was at an end. Boston, they believed, must be punished. Massachusetts must be made an example of, lest its defiance spread to the other colonies. In 1774, Parliament passed a series of laws known in Britain as the Coercive Acts. The Americans would call them the Intolerable Acts. The port of Boston was closed, crippling the city's economy. The Massachusetts government was dissolved, and its cherished right to self-rule was revoked. Town meetings were forbidden. The Quartering Act allowed the army to house soldiers in private buildings. It was a declaration of political warfare. London expected these harsh measures to isolate Massachusetts and terrify the other colonies into submission. It achieved the exact opposite. The other colonies saw the plight of Massachusetts as a preview of their own fate. From South Carolina to New Hampshire, they rallied to Boston's side, sending food and supplies. The committees of correspondence, now more active than ever, coordinated a unified response. The punishment of one colony had created a common cause for all. This common cause demanded a common voice. In September 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They met to formulate a collective response to the Intolerable Acts and to assert their rights as colonists. The delegates were a diverse group: radicals like Samuel Adams, moderates like John Dickinson, and conservatives like Joseph Galloway. Despite their differences, they found common ground. They issued a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, affirming their loyalty to the Crown, but firmly denying Parliament's right to tax them without their consent. They also established the Continental Association, a colony-wide boycott of British goods. This was a direct economic assault on the British Empire. They agreed to meet again the following May if their grievances were not addressed. The actions of the First Continental Congress were revolutionary. For the first time, the colonies were acting as a single, unified body, a de facto government. They were no longer just 13 separate entities protesting a distant authority. They were a united front, coordinating policy and resistance on a continental scale. This step was crucial. It laid the organizational groundwork for revolution. While many still hoped for reconciliation, the path to independence was being paved. Back in London, the King and Parliament viewed the Congress's actions as an open rebellion. King George III declared, "The New England governments are in a state of rebellion. Blows must decide whether they are to be subject to this country or independent." The hope for a peaceful resolution was fading rapidly. More troops were dispatched to America, with orders for the military governor of Massachusetts, General Thomas Gage, to seize colonial military supplies and arrest the key Patriot leaders. The stage was now set for a direct military confrontation. The intolerable acts, designed to crush colonial defiance, had instead forged a continental union. The First Continental Congress, born out of this crisis, had transformed scattered protests into a coordinated resistance. Both sides were now on a collision course. The question was no longer if there would be a fight, but where and when the first shots would be fired. The answer would come on a spring morning in 1775, on a village green in a small town called Lexington. A war for American independence was about to begin. Have you ever wondered what pushes a people from protest to outright revolution? It often isn't a single event, but a rapid cascade of action and reaction, each more severe than the last. In the winter of 1773, Boston was a city on a knife's edge. The British government, desperate to assert its authority and bail out the struggling East India Company, had passed the Tea Act. To the colonists, this wasn't just about tea. It was about the principle of no taxation without representation. They saw it as a Trojan horse, a clever tactic to make them accept Parliament's right to tax them. Bostonians had tried to refuse the tea shipment, to send the ships back to England, but the royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson, wouldn't allow it. He was determined to see the tea landed and the tax paid. With the deadline looming, the Sons of Liberty knew they had to make a dramatic move. Following a massive town meeting that drew thousands, the Sons of Liberty executed a well-planned, almost military-style operation. This wasn't some spontaneous, drunken riot. It was a disciplined, deliberate act of political protest. Disguised as Mohawk Indians to conceal their identities, they methodically and quietly boarded the 3 tea ships docked in Griffin's Wharf. Over the next 3 hours, they worked with grim determination, hoisting 342 heavy chests of tea onto the decks, splitting them open with hatchets, and dumping the contents into the dark waters of the harbor. In this stunning act of defiance, they destroyed a fortune in private property, an amount equivalent to over $1 million today. The Boston Tea Party was not an act of rage. It was a calculated political statement. It was a direct, undeniable challenge to British authority, a line drawn in the sand that London simply could not ignore. When news of the destroyed tea finally crossed the Atlantic and reached London, the reaction was nothing short of apoplectic. From the king to the common man, there was a sense of profound shock and insult. All factions of the British political establishment, which had been divided on how to handle the colonies, were now united in outrage. This was seen as the ultimate act of colonial insolence, a direct assault on the Crown, Parliament, and private property. Patience was at an end. The time for debate and conciliation was over. In the halls of Westminster, the mood shifted from frustration to a demand for retribution. Boston, they believed, must be punished severely. The entire colony of Massachusetts must be made an example of, lest its rebellious spirit spread like a contagion to the other, quieter colonies. In the spring of 1774, driven by this thirst for vengeance, Parliament passed a series of punitive laws. In Britain, they were known as the Coercive Acts, but across the ocean, the Americans would give them a far more sinister name, the Intolerable Acts. First, the Boston Port Act. The port was completely closed to all trade, effective June 1st. This was a direct strike at the city's economic heart, designed to cripple its economy and starve its people into submission until the tea was paid for. Next, the Massachusetts Government Act fundamentally altered the colony's charter, dissolving its elected assembly and revoking its cherished right to self-rule. Town meetings, the bedrock of local democracy, were now forbidden without the royal governor's consent. Then came the Quartering Act, which allowed the army to house soldiers not just in public buildings, but in private, occupied homes and buildings if necessary. It was a declaration of political warfare, a set of measures designed to isolate Massachusetts and terrify the other 12 colonies into obedience. But London's strategy backfired spectacularly. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, The intolerable acts did the exact opposite. The other colonies looked at Boston I's plight and didn't see a rebellious outlier getting its just deserts. They saw a preview of their own potential fate. They saw a blueprint for how Britain could crush their own liberties, one by one. The shared threat forged an unprecedented sense of unity. From the farms of South Carolina to the shipyards of New Hampshire, they rallied to Boston's side, sending wagon loads of food, supplies, and money to help the blockaded city survive. The Committees of Correspondence, the Intercolonial Communication Network, kicked into overdrive, coordinating a unified response. The punishment of one colony had created a common cause for all. The intolerable acts, meant to enforce control, had instead lit the fuse for a continental Congress and set the American colonies on a direct path to war. Spring 1775. The fragile peace in Massachusetts was about to shatter. General Thomas Gage, the British military governor in Boston, received secret orders from London. His mission, to seize the colonial militia's cache of weapons and gunpowder, reportedly stored in the town of Concord, and to arrest the two most prominent radical leaders, Samuel Adams and John Hancock. On the night of April 18th, 700 of Britain's finest troops, the elite grenadiers and light infantry, began to move out of Boston under the cover of darkness. They believed their mission was a secret, a swift strike to decapitate the growing rebellion before it could truly begin. But the Patriots' intelligence network, a web of spies and sympathizers woven throughout the city, was faster. Dr. Joseph Warren, a key figure in the Sons of Liberty, confirmed the British movements. He dispatched two riders, Paul Revere, a silversmith known for his revolutionary zeal, and William Dawes, a tanner with a more discreet reputation. Their task was to alert Adams and Hancock in Lexington and then warn the countryside. The famous signal was arranged. From the steeple of the Old North Church, lanterns would shine, one if by land and two if by sea. A message to patriots across the river in Charlestown, confirming the British route. As the lanterns flared, Revere was rowed silently past the HMS Somerset, a massive British warship, its shadow looming in the harbor. On the other shore, he mounted a horse and began his desperate ride. Revere and Dawes thundered through the sleeping villages of Middlesex County, their urgent cries echoing in the night. The regulars are coming out. This was not a call to arms for a nation yet to be born. It was a warning from one Englishman to another that the army of their own king was marching to seize their property and their rights. It was a violation of what they saw as their fundamental liberties. Revere reached Lexington around midnight, finding Adams and Hancock at the home of Reverend Jonas Clark. After delivering his warning, he was joined by Dawes and a young doctor named Samuel Prescott. The three set off for Concord, spreading the alarm further. However, their journey was cut short by a British patrol. Revere was captured. Though later released, Dawes was thrown from his horse and forced to escape on foot. But Prescott, familiar with the backwoods, managed to leap a wall and carry the warning all the way to Concord. Across the countryside, the network effect of their warning was explosive. Church bells began to toll, a somber, urgent peal that cut through the darkness. Signal guns fired, spreading the alarm from town to town. Minutemen farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, and artisans who had pledged to be ready at a minute's notice grabbed their muskets and powder horns. They kissed their families goodbye and hurried, fearful farewells, and began to gather on their village greens. These were not soldiers in a formal sense. They were citizens, neighbors, fathers, and sons, now transformed by circumstance into a citizen army, prepared to defend their homes against the world's most powerful military force. The night was no longer silent. It was alive with the sound of running feet, shouted orders, and the grim determination of a people pushed to their limit. At dawn on April 19th, the British advance column, weary from their all-night march, arrived at Lexington. There, on the town common, they were met by a small, defiant line of about 70 colonial militiamen. They were hopelessly outnumbered, facing a force 10 times their size. Their captain, John Parker, a veteran of the French and Indian War, was pragmatic but firm. He reportedly told his men, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." He knew they couldn't win a pitched battle, but they could make a stand, a symbolic and potent gesture of defiance. The British commander, Major John Pitcairn, rode forward, his voice cutting through the tense morning air, ordering the rebels to lay down their arms and disperse. In the tense, confusing moments that followed, with soldiers and militiamen staring each other down across the green, a single shot rang out. To this day, no one knows for certain who fired it. Was it a nervous militiaman? A jumpy redcoat? Or perhaps an accidental discharge? The origin of that single sound is lost to history, but its effect was instantaneous and irreversible. The British regulars, believing they were under attack, unleashed a devastating volley of fire into the militia's ranks. The colonists, stunned and overwhelmed, broke and ran. When the smoke cleared, 8 militiamen lay dead or dying on the green, and another 10 were wounded. The British suffered only a single minor casualty. The war had begun not with a declaration, but with a sudden, bloody skirmish on a village common. The shot, whoever fired it, had indeed been heard round the world. The fire of revolution was now truly lit. The British regulars responded with a devastating volley, followed by a bayonet charge. The militia scattered. When the smoke cleared, 8 Americans lay dead. The British column reformed and marched on towards Concord. They had no idea that the hornet's nest had just been struck. At Concord's North Bridge, they were met by a much larger force of militiamen who, in a stunning exchange, drove the redcoats back. The long, agonizing march back to Boston began. The 19-mile road from Concord became a terrifying gauntlet of death. Thousands of militiamen, swarming from all corners of the countryside, poured a relentless fire into the British column. By the time the survivors staggered back to the safety of Boston, nearly 300 of their comrades were killed, wounded, or missing. In a single day, the political dispute had transformed into a bloody war. The British Army found itself trapped, besieged in the city of Boston by a newly formed makeshift army of New England farmers. As the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia, they faced a stark reality. They adopted the militia forces around Boston as their own, creating the Continental Army, and to lead it, they made the most important decision of the war. They appointed a 43-year-old Virginia planter, George Washington. He had the military experience, the gravitas, and crucially, being from Virginia. His appointment would ensure that this was not just a New England squabble, but an American cause. Before George Washington even reached Boston in June 1775, the simmering conflict exploded into open war. At the Battle of Bunker Hill, colonial militia, dug in behind a rough earthen wall, unleashed devastating fire upon the advancing British Army. The disciplined redcoats, marching in perfect lines, eventually took the ground, but the victory was hollow. They suffered over 1,000 casualties. One British general grimly noted that another victory like this would completely destroy their army. The battle was a stark lesson. It proved that American farmers and tradesmen could stand toe-to-toe with the most professional soldiers in the world. But it also revealed a critical weakness. Bravery wasn't enough. The Americans ultimately lost the hill because they ran out of ammunition, and they desperately needed one thing to break the stalemate and drive the British out of Boston: heavy cannons. The answer to this seemingly impossible problem came from a very unexpected man. Henry Knox was a 25-year-old bookseller from Boston. He was a large man with an even larger intellect and ambition. Though he had no formal military training, he was a self-taught expert, having devoured every book on military strategy and engineering he could find in his own shop. When war broke out, he volunteered his services to Washington. The new commander-in-chief saw the spark of genius in the young man and gave him a mission that bordered on madness. Knox's plan was breathtakingly audacious. He proposed to lead an expedition 300 miles into the winter wilderness. His destination was Fort Ticonderoga in New York, which had recently been captured by the Americans. His goal was to retrieve its massive arsenal of cannons and drag them all the way back to Boston. It sounded insane. Knox and his team of men and oxen embarked on this incredible journey. They battled through treacherous forests, hauled the cannons across frozen rivers, and muscled them over the snow-choked Berkshire Mountains. In an astonishing display of endurance and sheer willpower, they dragged nearly 60 tons of heavy artillery, with some cannons weighing over 5,000 pounds, through the harshest conditions of a New England winter. Then, in late January 1776, the army watched in disbelief as Knox's noble train of artillery arrived at the camp outside Boston. Washington finally had the weapon he needed. He now held the key to victory. Under the cover of a single night, he ordered his men to secretly fortify Dorchester Heights, the hills overlooking the city. They worked tirelessly, wrestling Knox's heavy cannons into position, creating a powerful battery aimed directly at the British army below, and their fleet anchored in the harbor. When the sun rose the next morning, the British commander, General Howe, peered through his spyglass. His face was a mask of shock and horror. His entire position was now indefensible. Rather than risk a repeat of the slaughter at Bunker Hill, Howe knew he was beaten. He chose to evacuate. On March 17, 1776, St. Patrick's Day, the entire British Army, along with more than 1,000 Loyalist supporters, boarded their ships and sailed away from Boston. George Washington had achieved his first great victory of the war, and he had done it without firing a single cannon in anger. Through brilliant strategy and the incredible determination of a Boston bookseller, he had outmaneuvered a global superpower and liberated the first major city of the Revolution. While George Washington was winning battles on the field, another war was being waged for the American mind, and its chief architect was Thomas Paine. His pamphlet, Common Sense, unleashed in January 1776, was nothing short of a political firestorm. Imagine, at a time when kings and queens were seen as divinely appointed, Paine boldly rejected the very idea of monarchy and hereditary rule. He wasn't writing for scholars or elites. He wrote in plain, powerful language that resonated with farmers, merchants, and artisans. He laid out a simple, undeniable argument for immediate independence from Britain. The impact was electric. Common Sense sold over 100,000 copies in just a few months, a staggering number for the time. It spread like wildfire, passed from hand to hand in taverns and town squares, convincing countless Americans that trying to reconcile with the crown was a fool's errand. Paine's words helped them see a new destiny, not as subjects of a distant king, but as the founders of a new kind of nation, built on the principles of liberty. The powerful current of Paine's ideas surged through the halls of the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. The delegates, once hesitant, were now galvanized. This momentum culminated on July 4, 1776, when they formally adopted Thomas Jefferson's masterpiece, the Declaration of Independence. This wasn't just a breakup letter to King George. It was a revolutionary statement of human rights and a profound moral argument for revolution. It introduced the radical idea that all men are created equal, endowed with inalienable rights. And it declared that governments don't get their power from God or by birthright, but from the consent of the governed. This was a direct challenge to the old world order. The men who put their names to this document were no longer just protesters. They were now traitors to the British crown. By signing, they were staking their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on the hope of creating a free and independent America. The die was cast. But even as the bells of liberty rang out in Philadelphia, a storm was gathering. The full, terrifying might of the British Empire was about to be unleashed. A massive invasion force, the largest ever sent from Britain, descended upon New York Harbor. Hundreds of warships filled the horizon, a breathtaking and intimidating display of imperial power. What followed was a disaster for the fledgling American army. General Washington's forces were shattered in a series of brutal defeats on Long Island and Manhattan. The well-trained British and Hessian soldiers overwhelmed the inexperienced Continental troops, forcing Washington into a desperate, humiliating retreat across New Jersey. Morale plummeted. Soldiers deserted. By the bitter winter of 1776, the Revolution was hanging by a thread on the very brink of total collapse. Many believed the glorious cause was lost. But Washington, facing the abyss, would soon mastermind one of the most audacious gambles in military history. On a frozen, treacherous Christmas night in 1776, with the cause of liberty flickering like a dying candle, George Washington executed his legendary crossing of the ice-choked Delaware River. He led his ragged, freezing army in a surprise attack on the Hessian garrison at Trenton. The victory was swift and stunning. Days later, he followed it up with another brilliant tactical victory at Princeton. These two small battles had an enormous psychological impact. They weren't just military wins. They were a shot of adrenaline straight to the heart of the Revolution. They saved the Continental Army from disintegration, restored faith in Washington's leadership, and reminded the world that the fight for American independence was far from over. However, the war was still a long way from won. The British still held the strategic prize of New York City, and as the campaign season of 1777 approached, they were preparing to launch a new grand strategy, a master plan they believed would finally crush the rebellion once and for all. The British plan for 1777 was ambitious, and on paper, brilliant. It was a massive, three-pronged pincer movement designed to achieve a single, decisive objective: seize control of the Hudson River Valley. Why the Hudson? Because controlling it would effectively sever New England, the very heart of the rebellion, from the rest of the colonies. The strategy involved three separate armies converging on the city of Albany, New York. First, General John, Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, would lead a large army south from Canada, coming down through Lake Champlain. Simultaneously, a second, smaller force under Colonel St. Leger would push east from the Mohawk Valley. And finally, the main British army in America, commanded by General William Howe, was supposed to advance north from New York City. The idea was that these three forces would meet at Albany, splitting the colonies in two and allowing the British to defeat the isolated American armies in detail. It was a classic, Continental-style military plan, perfectly logical and meticulously designed to end the war. But war rarely follows the logic of a map. Thanks for watching. As the British armies began to move, America's greatest statesman was embarking on a mission of his own, one that was just as critical as any battle. Benjamin Franklin, already a legend across Europe for his scientific discoveries, arrived in Paris. His goal? To persuade the absolute monarchy of France to provide aid, and ultimately, to enter the war as an ally to the fledgling American Republic. It was a monumental task, a diplomatic tightrope walk of the highest order. Think about it. France was still reeling from its defeat to Britain in the 7 Years' War. They were eager for revenge, sure, but hesitant to back a rebellion that might fizzle out, leaving them to face the full wrath of the British Empire alone. Franklin understood this perfectly. He wasn't just there to ask for help. He needed to prove that the American cause was a winning bet. He needed a major victory on the battlefield to seal the deal. That victory would come at a place called Saratoga. General John Burgoyne's march south from Canada started with promise, but soon bowed down in the dense, unforgiving American wilderness. His supply lines were stretched dangerously thin, and his polished redcoats were relentlessly harassed by American militia, masters of guerrilla tactics. Making matters worse, General Howe, The British commander-in-chief, who was supposed to march north to meet him, inexplicably chose to move his army to capture the American capital of Philadelphia instead. This decision left Burgoyne completely isolated, a lone army deep in hostile territory. In two brutal battles in the autumn of 1777, the American army, officially commanded by General Horatio Gates, but inspired on the ground by the battlefield heroics of the controversial General Benedict Arnold, finally stopped Burgoyne's advance. Surrounded, his army shattered, with no hope of reinforcement, General Burgoyne was forced to do the unthinkable. On October 17th, he surrendered his entire force of nearly 6,000 men. The Battle of Saratoga wasn't just a battle. It was the great turning point of the war. It was the stunning, decisive victory that Benjamin Franklin had been waiting for. News of the surrender electrified Paris. It was the proof the French court needed. The Americans could and would win. In February of 1778, France signed a treaty of alliance, formally recognizing the United States and declaring war on Great Britain. Money, supplies, and most importantly, the might of the French army and navy were now committed to the American cause. The colonial rebellion had just become a world war. The winter of 1777 at Valley Forge was the crucible of the American Revolution. For George Washington and his Continental Army, it was a time of unimaginable suffering. Imagine thousands of men huddled together in makeshift huts, battling not just the bitter cold, but starvation, disease, and despair. Their clothes were rags, many had no shoes, leaving bloody footprints in the snow. Typhoid, dysentery, and pneumonia swept through the camp, claiming more lives than any battle had. Morale was at rock bottom. The glorious cause of independence seemed like a distant, fading dream. Soldiers deserted daily, and the very survival of the army and the revolution itself hung by a thread. Washington himself wrote of the dire situation, pleading with a seemingly deaf Congress for supplies that never came. It felt like the end. But in the midst of this darkness, a flicker of hope. A messenger arrives, braving the treacherous winter roads, carrying news that would change the course of history. France, a global superpower and Britain's age-old rival, had officially recognized the United States and signed a treaty of alliance. For the freezing, starving soldiers at Valley Forge, this wasn't just diplomatic news. It was a lifeline. It meant money, supplies, and most importantly, the might of the French Navy and Army joining their fight. The news spread through the camp like wildfire, and a cheer, weak but defiant, rose from the throats of men who had forgotten how to hope. The war was no longer a colonial rebellion. It had become a global conflict, and the odds had just dramatically shifted in America's favor. This newfound hope was soon given a human face in the form of one of the most colorful and crucial figures of the Revolution, Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben. He was a Prussian officer, a veteran of the most disciplined army in Europe, who arrived at Valley Forge with an offer from Benjamin Franklin to volunteer his services. He spoke almost no English, and his official title of Baron and his rank of Lieutenant General were, shall we say, a bit exaggerated for effect. But what he lacked in linguistic skills or a verifiable noble title, he more than made up for in pure, unadulterated military genius. He saw the American soldiers not as a rabble, but as men with immense spirit who simply lacked proper training. So with a French translator at his side, Steuben got to work. He didn't just write a manual from a warm tent. He went down into the mud and snow himself. He took a single company of 100 men, his model company, and began drilling them personally. He taught them the fundamentals, how to stand at attention, how to march in formation, how to handle their muskets with speed and precision, and most critically, the effective use of the bayonet. He would curse them in German and French, then ask his translator to curse them in English, much to the amusement of the soldiers. But they respected him. They saw that this strange, loud foreigner cared, and that his methods worked. Soon, The men of the model company were drilling with a proficiency that stunned the rest of the army. Steuben's system was brilliant in its simplicity. The 100 men he trained then became trainers themselves, spreading the knowledge company by company, regiment by regiment. A standard drill manual, written by Steuben in French and translated by Alexander Hamilton and Nathaniel Greene, was distributed throughout the army. What had been a collection of disparate militia units, each with its own way of doing things, was slowly and surely being molded into a single, cohesive fighting force. The transformation was astonishing. The men who had shuffled into Valley Forge as weary survivors were now standing taller. They marched with purpose. They were no longer just rebels. They were soldiers. When the Continental Army marched out of Valley Forge in the spring of 1778, they were a completely different entity. They were fewer in number, thinned by the harsh winter, but those who remained were hardened, disciplined, and unified. They were a professional army, ready to face the British regulars on an open field of battle and win. The test came quickly at the Battle of Monmouth, where the newly trained American troops performed with remarkable skill and resilience, holding their own against the best of the British Army in one of the longest battles of the war. Valley Forge was the Army's darkest hour, but it was also its rebirth. It was where the French alliance provided the hope, and Baron von Steuben provided the steel, forging the weapon that would ultimately win American independence. The French alliance and the professional training at Valley Forge had given the Continental Army a new lease on life. But while the war raged on, from the Battle of Monmouth in the north to a brutal, grinding campaign in the south, another, quieter struggle was unfolding. It was the struggle to create a government, to define what this new union of states would actually be. The Declaration of Independence had severed ties with the king. Now, the Americans had to decide how to govern themselves, a task that would prove nearly as challenging as defeating the British Empire. The first attempt at a national government was born from a deep-seated fear of centralized power. Having just thrown off the yoke of a powerful king in Parliament, the last thing the states wanted was to create a new tyrant of their own. The result was the Articles of Confederation, drafted in 1777 and finally ratified in 1781. It was less a blueprint for a nation and more a firm league of friendship between 13 sovereign republics. The states retained almost all of their power. The national government was a mere afterthought. Under the Articles, the central government was intentionally weak. There was no president to enforce the laws, and no national judiciary to interpret them. The unicameral Congress could declare war, but it could not raise an army. It could only request troops from the states. It could borrow money, but it could not levy taxes to repay its debts. It could not even regulate commerce between the states, which soon began to treat each other like foreign rivals, erecting tariffs and trade barriers that choked the nation's economy. To pass any meaningful law required the assent of 9 states. To amend the Articles themselves required the unanimous consent of all 13. It was a government designed for paralysis. In 1781, the war was won at Yorktown. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris made it official. America was independent. But this victory rang hollow. The new nation was flat broke. The government's paper money, the Continental, was so worthless it birthed a new phrase. Not worth a Continental. European powers, who once secretly aided the revolution, now openly disdained the young republic, denying it the trade deals it desperately needed. Britain, in a show of contempt, refused to leave its forts in the American West. Spain choked off the nation's economic artery, closing the Mississippi River to American trade. The nation that had defied an empire couldn't pay its bills or command respect. And most shamefully, it couldn't pay the very soldiers who had sacrificed everything for its freedom. This national crisis reached a boiling point in the harsh winter of 1786, out in the fields of western Massachusetts. Farmers, many of them the same men who had fought the British, were now facing a new enemy, their own government. They were losing their farms, their homes, their livelihoods, all because they couldn't pay crippling state taxes. These taxes had to be paid in hard currency, gold and silver, which they simply did not have. Led by a decorated war veteran, Captain Daniel Shays, they did what they knew best. They picked up their muskets again. In what became known as Shays' Rebellion, these farmers marched on courthouses, shutting them down to stop the foreclosures. It was a stunning and horrifying sight. American revolutionaries now at war with their own creation. The national government, under the Articles of Confederation, was completely powerless. It couldn't raise an army, couldn't raise money, couldn't do anything but watch the chaos unfold. News of the rebellion sent shockwaves across the 13 states. For leaders like George Washington, it was a nightmare come to life. It was the anarchy, the mob rule, the descent into civil war that European skeptics had always predicted for America. From his retirement at Mount Vernon, a distressed Washington wrote, "I am mortified beyond expression. Are we to have the goodly fabric that we have been 7 years raising pulled over our heads and ruined?" The rebellion served as a terrifying wake-up call. It was the catalyst that convinced many that the current system was a failure. Visionaries like Virginia S. James Madison and New York as Alexander Hamilton understood that tinkering with the Articles of Confederation wouldn't be enough. A drastic, fundamental overhaul was needed. The nation was at a precipice, and it would take a bold, radical rethinking of government itself to save it from collapsing. In the sweltering summer of 1787, 55 delegates from 12 states gathered in Philadelphia. Officially, their task was simple, to revise the failing Articles of Confederation. But a core group of nationalists had a far more radical agenda. From the very beginning, they seized control, imposing a strict vow of secrecy. The windows of the Pennsylvania State House were nailed shut, sealing them off from the public and the oppressive heat. Guards were posted at the doors. Here, in this sealed chamber, they began the clandestine work of dismantling one government and forging another from scratch. Presiding over this momentous gathering was George Washington. His presence alone, his immense prestige, lent an air of legitimacy to what was, in essence, a revolution. The delegates immediately began to grapple with the fundamental questions of governance and power. What does a republic truly look like? How can it balance liberty with order? The first major proposal to hit the floor was James Madison's Virginia Plan. It was audacious. It called for a powerful new national government with 3 distinct branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. Its legislature would have 2 houses, and critically, representation in both would be based on population. The large states, like Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts, were thrilled. This plan would give them power commensurate with their size, but the small states were terrified. Delaware, New Jersey, and Connecticut feared their interests would be utterly crushed, their voices silenced by the larger states. They saw a future where they would be nothing more than vassals to their powerful neighbors. In response, they put forward their own proposal, the New Jersey Plan. It was a more conservative approach, essentially an amendment of the old Articles. It kept a single-house legislature where every state, regardless of size, had 1 vote. For weeks, the convention was at a complete standstill. The air inside the assembly room was thick with tension, the oppressive heat matched only by the fiery passion of the debate. Delegates shouted, argued, and threatened to walk out. It seemed the entire American experiment was about to shatter before it even truly began. The very idea of a united nation hung by a thread, ready to snap under the weight of this bitter disagreement. The project was on the brink of total collapse. Then, out of the deadlock, a solution emerged. It was forged not by one man, but through negotiation and a willingness to bend. We call it the Great Compromise. It was a masterful piece of political craftsmanship proposed by delegates from Connecticut. It created the bicameral legislature we recognize today. The House of Representatives would be the voice of the people, with representation based directly on population, satisfying the large states. But the Senate would protect the sovereignty of the states, granting each one 2 senators, regardless of its size. This brilliant solution broke the impasse and saved the convention from ruin. But no sooner had they settled the conflict between large and small states than they confronted a much darker, more morally corrosive issue, one that had haunted the colonies for over a century: slavery. The debate shifted, the mood in the room turning somber and ugly. The poison of human bondage now flowed into the heart of the nation's founding document. Southern delegates, whose economies were built on the backs of enslaved people, demanded that these individuals be counted when determining representation in Congress. This would inflate their political power, giving them more seats in the House. Northern delegates were aghast at the hypocrisy. They pointed out the grotesque contradiction. How could the South claim these human beings as property for every conceivable purpose, denying them every basic right, yet count them as people solely to amass more political power for their masters? The debate laid bare the nation's original sin, a deep moral wound that would fester for decades to come. In the end, as with the issue of representation, they reached a compromise. It was a dirty, pragmatic bargain, a stain on the ideals of liberty being enshrined in the Constitution. The 3/5 compromise dictated that for purposes of both representation and taxation, 3/5 of the enslaved population would be counted. It was a deal born of expediency, a profound moral failure that kicked the can of disunion and civil war down the road. It was a chilling reminder that the new republic, born in the name of freedom, was compromised from its very inception. To count people for representation, a deeply flawed agreement was reached. It stated that an enslaved person would be counted as just 3/5 of a free person. This 3/5 compromise tragically cemented the institution of slavery into the very heart of the new government. It gave disproportionate power to the southern states, a power that would warp and twist American politics for the next 80 years, leading the nation down a dark and divided path. Another grim bargain was struck, forbidding Congress from outlawing the brutal international slave trade for at least 2 more decades. In their desperate drive to forge a more perfect union, the founders chose to accept one of history's gravest imperfections, kicking the can of human bondage down the road for future generations to confront. The consequences of these decisions would be catastrophic, a stain on the nation's soul. The delegates also wrestled with the very nature of the executive branch. They were haunted by the ghost of King George III, and many were terrified of creating a single, powerful president who could become another monarch. Some delegates proposed a 3-man executive committee, hoping to diffuse power. Others, perhaps surprisingly, suggested a president elected for life. The debate was fierce, passionate, and filled with anxiety. How could they create a leader strong enough to govern a vast and unruly nation, but not so strong that they could crush the people's liberty and become a despot? The solution, like so much else in that room, was a series of ingenious compromises. They decided on a single president, but one who would not be elected directly by the people. Instead, an electoral college would choose the leader for a limited 4-year term. He would be the commander-in-chief of the armed forces and have the power to veto legislation passed by Congress. But Congress would hold the ultimate power of the purse, controlling all spending, and only Congress could declare war, checking the president's military authority. It was a delicate, intricate dance of power. After 4 long, hot, arduous months of debate and compromise, they had finally forged a new constitution. It was a radical document, creating a government of separated powers, an intricate system of checks and balances designed to prevent any one branch from becoming too dominant. It established a federal system, a novel idea that divided authority between the national government and the individual states. On September 17, 1787, inside Independence Hall, 39 of the remaining delegates stepped forward to sign the document they had created. As the final members were adding their names, an aging and frail Benjamin Franklin pointed to the high-backed chair where George Washington had presided over the convention. Carved into its back was a painting of a sun on the horizon. Franklin quietly remarked that throughout the long, uncertain session, he had often looked at that sun without being able to tell if it was rising or setting on their new nation. But now, he said, at last he had the happiness to know that it was a rising and not a setting sun. But Franklin's optimism, while profound, was premature. The sun had not yet truly risen for the entire nation. The Constitution was, at that moment, merely a proposal, a piece of paper. It would only become the law of the land if it was ratified by special conventions in at least 9 of the 13 states. What followed was a year-long nationwide debate of unprecedented intensity and ferocity. Pamphlets flew from printing presses. Arguments raged in town squares and taverns from New Hampshire to Georgia. The country immediately split into 2 opposing camps: the Federalists who passionately supported the new Constitution and its promise of a strong central government, and the Anti-Federalists who feared it as a threat to liberty and the rights of the states. The great battle for America's future had just begun. The Federalists, led by Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay, launched a brilliant public relations campaign. In a series of 85 essays, known as the Federalist Papers, they masterfully dissected and defended every aspect of the new Constitution, arguing that a strong national government was not a threat to liberty, but its greatest guarantor. They argued it was the only alternative to the anarchy they had witnessed under the Articles. The Anti-Federalists were not disorganized critics. They were led by heroes of the Revolution, including Patrick Henry and George Mason of Virginia. They raised profound and troubling questions. They feared the new government was too powerful, its officials too far removed from the people. They worried the president could become a king, the Senate an aristocracy. But their most powerful and effective argument was the Constitution's most glaring omission. It contained no Bill of Rights to protect the citizens from this new, powerful government. "Where is the barrier?" Patrick Henry thundered, "to guard against the encroachments of power?" The battle for ratification was fought in state conventions across the country. Delaware was the first to ratify, but the real struggles were in the large, powerful states. In Massachusetts, ratification was secured only after Federalists promised to support the immediate addition of a Bill of Rights. In Virginia, after a legendary debate between Patrick Henry and James Madison, the Constitution was approved by a mere 10 votes. In New York, it passed by only 3. Finally, in June of 1788, New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify. The Constitution was now officially the law of the land. The founders had not only waged a revolution, they had created a second one, a peaceful, constitutional revolution that replaced a failed government with a bold and untested new design. The question that remained was whether this intricate machine, forged in secrecy and compromise, could actually work. The year is 1789. The ink on the Constitution is barely dry. A government that existed only on paper now needed to become a reality. A people who had emerged from a period of great change now had to learn the art of building a new society. Across the ocean, many prominent figures watched with skepticism, confident that the American experiment was destined to fall into disorder. The future of this unique endeavor was truly unknown. Everything depended on the first steps. For their first leader, the American people turned to the one indispensable man, a figure who commanded universal respect and admiration. By a unanimous vote of the first Electoral College, George Washington was chosen as the first President of the United States. He accepted the call with sincere hesitation, seeing the profound responsibility before him. On April 30th, 1789, he took the oath of office. His presence alone gave the new government a sense of legitimacy and importance it desperately needed. Washington understood that he was walking on untrodden ground, that his every action would set a pattern for the future. Working with the First Congress, he began to organize the executive branch. He appointed men of immense talent to lead the new departments. Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration, as Secretary of State. The brilliant planner Alexander Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury. And his trusted old comrade Henry Knox, to oversee the nation's security. These men would form the first presidential cabinet, an institution not detailed in the Constitution, but established by Washington's practical leadership. Congress, meanwhile, passed the Judiciary Act of 1789, which established the Supreme Court and a system of lower federal courts, bringing the third part of the governmental structure to life. But the most urgent piece of business was to follow through on the promise made to win national approval. In the House of Representatives, James Madison, once a skeptic of such additions, now became their most dedicated champion. He skillfully guided a series of proposals through Congress. 10 were approved by the states, and, in 1791, became part of the Constitution. The Bill of Rights was a monumental achievement. It affirmed in writing the essential personal protections that were at the heart of the recent period of change, and reassured those who were concerned about the scope of the new government. With the government structure in place, the nation faced a crisis of survival. It was bankrupt. The man tasked with solving this was the audacious Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. His bold and controversial financial plan would not only save the nation's credit, but would also ignite a profound ideological conflict over the future of America itself. A conflict embodied by the two towering figures in Washington's cabinet, Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton's plan was a three-part stroke of genius. First, he insisted the federal government assume the massive, unpaid war debts of the states, consolidating them into a single national debt. This, he argued, would bind the nation's wealthy creditors to the success of the federal government. If the nation thrived, they would be repaid. Second, he called for the creation of a national bank, the Bank of the United States, to manage the nation's finances, issue a stable currency, and provide loans to spur economic growth. Third, he proposed a system of tariffs and industrial subsidies to encourage domestic manufacturing and wean America off its dependence on European goods. It was a vision of a powerful, centralized, commercial, and industrial nation. To Thomas Jefferson, Hamilton's plan was a nationalist nightmare. He believed it would create a corrupt, moneyed aristocracy dependent on a powerful central government, just like the one they had fought a revolution to escape. He saw the independent, property-owning farmer as the bedrock of the republic, and feared that Hamilton's factories would create a dependent, urban working class. He and his ally in Congress, James Madison, argued that the plan rewarded speculators who had bought up war bonds for pennies on the dollar from poor soldiers. Most importantly, they argued that the creation of a national bank was unconstitutional, a dangerous overreach of federal power. The debate over Hamilton's plan, particularly the assumption of state debts, deadlocked Congress and threatened to tear the new government apart before it had even found its footing. The crisis was resolved not in a legislative hall, but over a dinner table. In one of the most famous compromises in American history, Jefferson hosted a private dinner for Hamilton and Madison. The deal was struck. Madison would cease his opposition and allow the debt assumption plan to pass Congress. In exchange, Hamilton would use his influence to ensure that the permanent national capital would be located in the South on the banks of the Potomac River, a move that would give the agrarian South greater influence over the federal government. With this dinner table bargain, the nation's financial system was born, and the site of its future capital was decided. The late 18th century was a whirlwind of revolution, a time when the fates of nations were decided by a few powerful men. In France, King Louis XVI, once the embodiment of absolute monarchy, now sat defeated. His opulent silks and powdered wig couldn't hide the storm that had consumed his kingdom. The French Revolution had not only toppled his throne, but sent shockwaves across the Atlantic, all the way to the newly formed United States of America. Across the ocean, President George Washington, the stoic leader who had guided America to independence, faced a monumental challenge. His young nation was caught between its old ally, France, and its old enemy, Great Britain, who are now at war. America was fragile, its future uncertain. Washington knew that choosing a side could mean the end of the American experiment he had fought so hard to create. He declared a policy of strict neutrality, a decision that would define his presidency and the course of American foreign policy for generations. But the French revolutionaries had other plans. They sent an envoy, a man named Edmond Genet, to rally American support. Genet was everything Washington was not: young, fiery, and a radical believer in the revolutionary cause. He landed not in the capital, but in Charleston, and immediately began commissioning American privateers to attack British ships and recruiting soldiers to fight for France. He was a diplomatic rock star, greeted by cheering crowds who saw him as a hero of liberty. Genet's defiance was a direct challenge to Washington's authority. He openly criticized the president, believing the American people would rise up with him against their own government. But he had fundamentally misunderstood America. He saw the cheering crowds, but he didn't see the deep respect the people had for their president. Washington, patient but firm, demanded that France recall its troublesome diplomat. Genet had overplayed his hand. In a strange twist of fate, the political winds in France shifted yet again. The radical faction that sent Genet was overthrown, and the new government issued a warrant for his arrest, likely meaning a trip to the guillotine. Genet, the man who tried to undermine Washington, now had to beg the American president for his life. In an incredible act of mercy, Washington granted him asylum. Citizen Genet would live out the rest of his days in America, a quiet farmer in New York, a living reminder of a time when the world was turned upside down. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories from history. In the crucible of revolution, amidst the thunder of cannons and the whispers of conspiracy, a new nation was forged. But who were the men who dared to dream of a republic, who risked everything for an idea called America? They were not gods, nor were they perfect. They were farmers, lawyers, printers, men of flesh and blood, burdened by doubt and driven by an audacious hope. Take George Washington, the reluctant hero. His face, etched with the hardships of war, told the story of a man who carried the weight of a fledgling country on his shoulders. He was the indispensable man, the steady hand that guided the Continental Army through its darkest hours at Valley Forge, a leader whose quiet strength became the bedrock of the presidency. He longed for the peace of his Mount Vernon farm, yet he answered the call of his country, not once, but time and again. Then there was John Adams, the fiery, brilliant, and often stubborn voice of independence from Massachusetts. While others wavered, Adams was a force of nature, relentlessly pushing for a complete break from Britain. His intellect was as sharp as his tongue, and his belief in the rule of law and a balanced government became a cornerstone of the Constitution. He was a diplomat, a vice president, and a president, a man who dedicated his entire life to the public good, often at great personal sacrifice. And who could forget Benjamin Franklin, the elder statesman, the witty inventor, the sage of Philadelphia? With a twinkle in his eye, Franklin charmed the courts of Europe, securing the crucial French alliance that turned the tide of the war. He was the wise grandfather of the Revolution, his clever words and diplomatic genius smoothing over fierce debates and uniting disparate factions. His signature on the Declaration of Independence was a bold stroke, but his true masterpiece was the art of compromise that helped weave 13 colonies into a single nation. These men, along with others, were the architects of liberty. They argued, they compromised, they made mistakes, but they never lost sight of the monumental task before them: to create a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Their legacy is not a static monument, but a living, breathing experiment in self-governance that continues to this day. They are the founding fathers, and their story is the story of America. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more stories that shaped our world.